Okay, so the next objection that I would like to consider here is an objection to the doctrine of the mean. Remember that Aristotle's doctrine of the mean is defined as on this slide, that virtue is a state of character concerned with choice lying in a mean relative to us, determined by a rational principle and by a principle by which the man of practical wisdom would determine it. So what I'd like for you to imagine here, okay, is that we pose Aristotle this question. Since the question is, how do we become happy? And part of the answer to that question is, well, we need to cultivate the virtues, or we need to conduct our rational animal life excellently, that is, in accordance with virtue, or arete. And so then the question is, well, what is arete? What is it to do a good job of living a rational animal life? So imagine we ask Aristotle this question: what is it to have the virtues? How do we tell what the virtues are? Another way to put this is, how do we tell what we should do? What kind of person we should try to be? How do we tell that, Aristotle? And imagine that Aristotle's answer is the doctrine of the mean. So in response to our question, Aristotle says, well, you need to cultivate just the right amount of each character attribute, neither too much nor too little, okay? If that's his response, which is in fact what seems to be what he's saying in the doctrine of the mean, then wouldn't it be fair for us to reply to that response by saying, Aristotle, you haven't answered my question. I wanted to know how I can tell what I should do and what kind of person I should try to be. And your response is, just be the right amount of each character attribute. In other words, don't be too much or too little of anything. The problem with that is, when you say don't be too much or too little, you're assuming that I already know what's too much or too little. But that's what I need to find out. What is too much or too little? Your answer doesn't actually answer my question, because it doesn't actually give me guidance about what amount of any character attribute I should cultivate. It basically just flips the question back on me and says, well, you figure out what the right amount is of every character attribute. So I think you can see why that response, the doctrine of the mean, may actually be a bit disappointing from the standpoint of someone who wants guidance about ethics. And if we look also at Aristotle's alternative formulations, then we see that they suffer from the same problem. So he says virtue, at one point he says virtue is acting to the right person, to the right extent, at the right time, with the right motive, and in the right way. But the problem with this is that if the question that we want answered by the doctrine of the mean is, what should I do? Then it's not much of an answer if they just tell us, well, do the right thing, right? Because that was the original question. So again, the problem is that this answer to the question seems to be empty. And likewise with the second alternative formulation. If we ask, what should we do? And Aristotle says, well, just do the thing that a wise person would do. That leads to the question, how do we tell who's wise? If we already knew who was wise, that is, who had the right answers to ethical questions, then we would already have an answer to the ethical questions, because how else would we be able to determine who was wise and who wasn't? So this answer also seems to be empty. It doesn't actually help us. It basically just assumes we already know the answer, or it depends on us already knowing the answer in order for it to work as an answer to the question. So if this is the objection to Aristotle's doctrine of the mean, then have we just shown that the doctrine of the mean is no good? Maybe. We may have shown a serious problem with it. But what would Aristotle say in reply? Is there any reply available to Aristotle? Can he possibly defend himself against this objection? Here's one possible defense, okay? So Aristotle could say, look, I'm not trying, and I shouldn't be trying, to give you a full answer to everything that you should do, independent of the details of your situation. What I'm giving you is a kind of guideline. I'm giving you some methods that you can use to help you to make a good decision based on your individual situation. And in fact, I shouldn't do more than that, because different individual situations are different. remember the wrestler who it's good for them to eat a certain amount of food, neither too much nor too little, but how much that is different than it is for somebody else. So since each of our situations call for judgments that are really specific to those situations, we shouldn't try to be too detailed and too specific in our general ethical theory. We should keep our general ethical theory a little bit open-ended so that people are able to apply it as needed and find the right answers in specific situations. You can remember also that early in the Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle said we shouldn't expect as much precision from ethics as we expect from mathematics. And so this could be another case where that applies. We want a general ethical theory that's helpful. We have some kind of general techniques we can use, like ask what a wise person would do here, or ask whether you're doing too much of a certain thing or too little of a certain thing, and try to find the right middle point. So those kinds of techniques are good ones to use for finding out what the right thing is to do in your specific situation, and we shouldn't try to lock things down any more specifically. Like, for instance, we shouldn't try to come up with like a table of 10 commandments that always apply, okay? Because Aristotle thinks maybe individual circumstances are a little bit more variable than that, and we rather should be asking about what's the right middle point, neither too much nor too little, in any given circumstance. And then the final objection I want to consider briefly is that Aristotle's views about happiness have the implication that people with disabilities can't be happy. Because if happiness is defined as this kind of overall healthy human life that involves the right role for reason, for instance, then those who are physically unhealthy in one way or another because of disabilities, say people who don't have the use of their legs, for instance, or people who have cognitive disabilities of one kind or another, and you could think also about like mental health issues that are due to brain chemistry, then you might think that those people can't be happy according to Aristotle's definition, since they have these kinds of there are kinds of features of their bodily existence that get in the way of their ability to fully live this happy, rational animal life that Aristotle is describing. Now, I'm not sure that there is an effective response to this that would defend Aristotle. Okay, so the reason why this could count as a strong criticism of Aristotle is that you might say, well, no, wait a minute, this is crazy. It's perfectly possible for mentally and physically disabled people to be just as happy as people who are not physically or mentally disabled. So if your theory says that they can't be, then that is really incorrect, right? And it's also, you might even say, somewhat insulting to people who have those mental or physical disabilities, and that's a bad thing, okay? So that is why it might be a criticism, or it should be a criticism of Aristotle's theory. But Aristotelians, I mean, and by the way, Aristotle himself didn't directly address this objection, but contemporary Aristotelians, that is, people who defend Aristotle's views in the present day and want to think that he was basically right about ethics and want to defend and kind of further his views, they do have a line of response to this, which goes as follows. So the reply is this. When we see people who have disabilities, or when we, like for instance, we're thinking about disability, about policies around people who have disabilities, right? Consider two possible responses that we could take as a society, okay? So one is we could say, well, those people have cognitive or physical disabilities, but there's no reason they couldn't be just as happy as anybody else, so we'll just let them be however they are, and that's it. The other possible response is to say, well, the fact that such people have certain cognitive or physical disabilities means that there are going to be certain barriers to their full human happiness unless something is done to try to ameliorate those conditions. So someone without the use of their legs, for instance, is not going to be able, just on their own, to be able to live the part of a healthy human life that involves mobility, that involves being able to get around. Okay, so what we should do is, according to this second line of thinking, we should try to increase their mobility so that their life can be more like that of someone who doesn't have the disability. In other words, we should make a wheelchair available to them, and we should make ramps so that they can get to all the same places that a person who doesn't have that disability can get to. And what this essentially does is it equalizes things so that they can live more of a life that's like the life of an abled person, a person who doesn't have that disability. And likewise with cognitive disabilities, through surgery or through neurochemical supplementation, medicines, and things like that, then there may be ways to enable people with cognitive disabilities or special educational trajectories. There may be ways to enable people with cognitive disabilities to have more of the kind of rational cognition of a naturally healthy, abled person. Okay, so that second line of response is the more Aristotelian response. It's the response that, so the way that Aristotelians interpret that is they say, look, Aristotle's account of what a happy human life is for human beings in general gives us the prototype. It gives us the kind of standard for what makes for a happy human life. And when we see people with disabilities, physical or cognitive, that look like they're going to impede people's ability to meet that standard or to have a life that fits that general pattern, then what we ought to do is look for ways to supplement their lives so that they can actually have a life that fits the normal, natural human pattern. Okay, so again, I'm not sure whether that reply is effective and whether or not it convinces you all, but that is one possible reply to the objection that Aristotelians can make. Okay, that brings us to the end of our account of the objections to Aristotle that I wanted to emphasize for you, and we'll see each other next time.